so please try to stick to the instructions. Homework 3 is available online. At least question 1 should be accessible to you, and that's the warm-up question. As we see more in today's lecture and Wednesday's lecture, we should be able to do the whole of the homework. One additional and important rule that has been added to the game is that you're allowed only 10 pages of text at a reasonable font size, something that I can read, because I don't want to see a thesis in the homework. Any questions about that or anything?
What about incorporating code into the actual PDF you hand in?
Please don't do that.
Okay.
We can't execute PDFs, so no. Submit it as a separate executable. In fact, yeah,
that's just because in some classes, if they wanted to see that, so they don't do it against.
Yeah, we can open the text file if necessary.
Okay.
And the other thing that was anyway, homework 3 does not have any code, so that's it can either be a really good thing or a really bad thing depending on your perspective on life. It's entirely theory, which is probably easier or harder, I don't know. Any questions? And my throat is kind of at mediocre functionality today, so I might not be able to shout out for too long. Okay, so let's continue where we were. So in the last lecture we saw this thing about how we started this process of analyzing conjunctions. So we defined a very trivial learning algorithm that can learn conjunctions, and we started thinking about what does it mean to learn, and what does it mean? What does it mean to analyze a learning algorithm? And just to remind you, we are operating in the batch setting. We have been looking at online learning, and online and batch learning are just different ways of looking at learning. To remind you where we are, in the online setting, there was no assumption about the distribution of examples, whereas in the batch setting, you assume that there is a fixed, possibly unknown distribution over the train and test examples. In the online setting, learning algorithm is typically has the following structure. You get an example, you make a prediction, and then you get the true label, and maybe you might update if there's a mistake. In batch learning, the game is completely different. You're given a collection of training examples, all of which are drawn IID from the distribution, and you do whatever you want with it, and you produce a function that you believe best represents that data. And the goal in online learning is to bound the mistakes over time, whereas the goal in batch learning is to see how well your hypothesis that you produce at the end of training does on future examples that are drawn from the same distribution. So in the last few lectures, we were operating in this regime, and that's where we saw the perceptron and the Winnow and such algorithms. And going forward, we'll be on that side. We are looking at analyzing batch learning. Okay? So let's look at this idea called probably approximately correct learning. The plan today is we'll analyze the simple algorithm for conjunctions. I'll define the path model of learning more formally. And if we have time, we'll look at connections to Occam's razor. So we'll start off by analyzing conjunctions, and this analysis is mostly to give you a feel for what it means to analyze the learning algorithm. And we're looking at a very simple setup that we've seen before, and it's a setup where we control everything, and so it lets us actually work out the details up to the end. So the true concept is a conjunction, and in this case, for example, the true concept is a conjunction of 5 variables, x2, x3 through x5, and x10. So the function is 1 if all of them are present in the input. If even one of them is absent, the function is false. You're given training examples like the one here. And the learning algorithm that we'll be looking at is a very, very simple one. Step 1, ignore all the negative examples. Step 2, look at all the positive examples and look at the variables that are common to all positive examples and form a conjunction out of this. A rather simple algorithm. And from this data set, you'll get a conjunction that has x1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 100. Why? Because, well, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 100 is obvious because they are present in every conjunction, every positive example. It just so happens that 1 is also present. And we've seen this example before. So, x1 is, even though x1 is present in the conjunction, the hypothesis that this algorithm produces is consistent in the sense that it's consistent with the training set. It will correctly classify every example in the training set. You see that? And it's sort of a small mental exercise to prove that it's correct formally. All you need to do is just to say that if it was not the case, then there must be at least one example where it's a mistake. If that example is positive, what will happen? If that example is negative, what will happen? And show both of them lead to a contradiction. Okay, so let's start the process of analyzing this. The first claim that I'll make is any hypothesis that's consistent with your entire training set, any hypothesis that's produced by this algorithm and is consistent with your training set, will only make mistakes on positive examples in the future. And this is roughly where we left off in the last lecture, so let's continue here. Any consistent hypothesis will only make mistakes on positive examples. Why?
Because we already have subset of all the ones.
Can you say that again?
Because we already have subset of all the ones, so superset of all the ones. So
Yes. So you have a superset of all the, let's call them valid literals or variables, and so you cannot make a mistake on a negative example, because on every negative example at least one of them has to be missing. The proof goes like this. A mistake will occur only if there's a literal that's present in an example is present in the hypothesis but not in the true function, like that x1 there. So if x1 happens to be present in the example, what will happen? Sorry, if x1 is absent in the example, what will happen? H will predict it as false and F will predict it as true. So assuming, of course, all the others are there. And this is the only kind of mistake that can happen. The opposite can never happen because of that, the reason that you just mentioned. We have a superset of all the valid literals.
Just to clarify, this claim is specific to the space of...
This is, at least for the next 10 minutes, everything that we say is very specific to this function and this algorithm. Or this concept class and this hypothesis space.
Can I ask you to turn off some of the lights?
Sure. Which ones? Well, I'll turn off some switches. We'll see what happens. Is that better?
No, yeah, I think we should.
Nope, that's the one.
Yeah. Right now, only one switch is on, and this is, I think, the lowest we can go. Yes.
So why, and there will be a mistake if they say the label is 0 and all of the x's are 1.
Can you say that again? Which one 0?
So the label is 1 for a test set.
The label is 1 for a test set.
Example is there's an example where the label is 0 and all the x's are 1.
If all the x's are 1, both f and h will predict true, right? F.
Oh, right.
So
yes.
this is our true function, the hidden function which,
But
at least for this moment, is unhidden. So the concept class is conjunction. In fact, it's a monotone conjunction. So is the contrast any better now? I don't know. This is the best I can do. I'll try to avoid colored boxes in the future. Okay, so basically what will happen is we have if you think of, this is just another way of putting the same thing, same information. If you think of functions as enclosing a set of examples as positive, F will be a bigger set than H. So that box there is the instance space, and F and H are just enclosing positive examples. So this is an easy to verify claim. This lets us build up the full theorem. And I'll state the theorem first and walk you through the proof. And we'll look at the interpretation. Suppose we are learning a conjunctive function, meaning both the hypothesis class and the concept class is a conjunction. And let's say, suppose the function is a function of n variables. If you have m training examples and m is greater than this expression here, you don't have to pass this expression yet, m is greater than some number, then with high probability, with a probability greater than 1 minus delta, the learned hypothesis will make an error that's less than epsilon. So here, the way you interpret this is, if you see enough training examples, the algorithm will produce a conjunction that with high probability will not make too many mistakes. Okay? And I'll let you stare at this for a minute, because if you've never seen this kind of a statement before, the sheer number of Greek in this might be overwhelming. Yes.
So, what is the distribution you assume on the data?
It's fixed and unknown. It's any distribution.
Oh, you didn't assume.
I didn't assume. So all of batch learning assumes that the distribution on the data is fixed but unknown. But the important part is it's fixed, meaning the distribution is consistent between the training set and any future examples. And that is really the only hope we have for proving any statement like this. Yes.
Is this like a batch algorithm?
Yes.
Then what do you exactly mean by future data?
What I mean is there's a training set. You train your hypothesis on that. You train your classifier on that. And the future examples are when this classifier is applied on, say, a test set, on unseen examples, on any example that's not in the training.
The high probability is the probability of producing a conjunction.
Yes. Yes. The probability that you'll produce a function
with that,
which has a probability of error less than epsilon. Yes.
What does it mean by error less than epsilon?
Can you speak up? Sorry.
What does it mean by error less than epsilon?
Error less than epsilon can be, remember that we spoke about generalization error and the training error. Generalization error is the probability that on a new example, your classifier will make a mistake. And training error is basically the fraction of the training data that your classifier has made a mistake. And we know that this algorithm produces a consistent hypothesis, so training error is 0.
Sorry, can I miss this? What does it mean by polynomial?
Oh, I didn't mention that at all. I just wanted to point out, this is mostly for future reference, if you come back to these slides, just to point out that this expression here is a polynomial in n, 1 over delta, and 1 over epsilon. And that property makes this a pack guarantee, but we'll see that later. This is mostly for you to realize when you go through these slides again. So let's try to prove this assertion. Okay? And to prove this, let me just introduce this quantity P of z. P of z is a probability that a feature, which is basically a literal, a variable, is absent in an example, but the example has a positive label. Okay? Now, these are the features, if you think about it, that can possibly cause trouble in the future. Let's say your classifier has learned x1 and x2 and so on. P of x1, if it's 0, then you're okay. Because x1 will never show up in a positive example, so there's no error. It's only those fraction of cases where x1 shows up that we'll see a problem. So, also on the training set, P of z is 0. On any not training set, on any literal that's in the concept, P of z is 0, because z is always present in positive examples because it's a conjunction. Okay? So let's try to use this P of z. First of all, I want to point out that the true error of any hypothesis, because this is a conjunctive class, is going to be bounded by the sum of P of z in that hypothesis. Why? Because the hypothesis is a conjunction. The true error is the error of a hypothesis can be error because of x1 or error because of x2 or x3 or so on. This or this or this or this, and probability of that, which is upper bounded by the union, by the sum of those things. This is the union bound of probabilities. You're awfully quiet. Okay, let's just go on.
Why does Z exist in H?
Z is any literal. Z can be x1, x2 or anything.
Okay.
Z is
It's any of the features.
it's any of the features. Z is just an index for the features. I didn't want to use x because then it's confusing.
When Z is absent, in an example, is it a Z? Is it 0?
That feature is not there in the example. That's 0.
That feature itself is 0.
Yeah. So the primary takeaway here is that the error of a hypothesis is upper bounded by the sum of this P of z's. Okay? Let's just keep that thing in mind. And now let's think about this P of z a little bit more. Suppose we call certain literals to be bad if P of z is more than is really large, is more than epsilon over n. Now, a bad literal is one that has a high probability of showing up, of not appearing in a positive example. Like in x1, for example, it will be bad if it has a high probability of not showing up with a positive example, and yet somehow on our training set, it always showed up with positive examples. So if this literal always showed up with positive examples in the training set and never shows up with any positive examples in the test set, those are the ones that are going to cause us trouble because it's a conjunction. So if there are no bad literals, then the error is upper bounded by epsilon. Why? Because we just showed that error is the sum of these things. If each of them is epsilon over n, there are only n literals, so a very loose upper bound for this summation is epsilon. Make sense? At least, if
Epsilon is the error for our hypothesis, right?
epsilon is an upper bound for the error of our height. This is what basically what this says is that if P of z is
Error for every literal.
is the error for every literal, and there are the probability that there are no bad literals. If there are no bad literals, then your hypothesis will have at most error, epsilon error.
So PZ should be epsilon, PZ times and sum of all probabilities times n should be epsilon.
Upper bound.
Because
These
that's
are all
our
equal.
upper bound, right?
These are all inequalities. There are no equalities here.
Yeah, but we are saying that sum of all errors is the upper bound as
Yes.
well as epsilon is we are denoting upper bound by epsilon. So
We
how
are
are these two related?
no. The only way we introduce epsilon is to say that P of z, the probability that there is this
So
literal that
we are assuming this first statement is just
yes,
assumption.
we're just assuming that if this case happens,
Okay.
then the error will be
Epsilon.
of this of a hypothesis with no bad literals can at most be epsilon. Okay. So really, the situation when there are no bad literals is actually a good place to be, because our error is at most epsilon, and epsilon is going to be a small number. The case that we don't want is when there are actually bad literals. So let's see what will happen if there are bad literals. So there are bad literals. Let's say that there's some z that's a bad literal. What is the probability? And every training example can eliminate some of these things, right? So x1 could have been eliminated by any one of the training examples. So let's ask, what's the probability? Yes.
And if it appears in not positive, then
I can't hear you.
and it appears in all positive, then we come to different cause again. It does not appear.
If it does not appear, we don't care. So we are worried about this case of the case of x1 in our running example, where x1 came up with every positive example, right? If it appears with every positive example, and then in the future it shows up with no positive example, then it's a bad thing. Did I say that right? Okay. So, sorry?
I didn't get it.
You didn't get it. So, let's say we have a literal x1. x1 came with every positive example in the training set. Okay? And in the test set, let's say it doesn't show up with an example, with a positive example. Your true function will predict it, could predict it as no. If x1, let me write this down because I can't reason without actually staring at those functions. Oh, they took the one marker that was here. So you have f is right. Now let's say, now the reason you got x1 in H is because every training example had feature 1 that's associated with positive examples. Now let's say a new example comes in. When will F and H agree?
Positive example where x1 doesn't show.
A positive example where x1 doesn't show. What does that mean? So something like, so you have 0, 1, 1, 1, and many zeros and a 1. Something like this. This will be predicted by F as a plus and H as a minus. What we are asking here is, let's say the probability of such this particular literal being 0, let's say it's upper bounded. Okay? It's lower bounded. If the probability that x1 is, this particular example will show up, if it is greater than epsilon over n, we are going to call x1 a bad literal because it is the one that has caused us trouble. In your entire training set, x1 always showed up with positive examples. Now suddenly in your test set, x1 does not show up. Now, effectively what we are asking is, what is the probability that the training set is a surprising set such that in spite of this x1 in expectation, you don't expect it to show up, and yet you collected m examples where every single time it showed up. That's a very surprising thing. Now this whole analysis is trying to ask, how surprising is it? If there is no such x1, your error will be bounded by epsilon. If there is an x1, then what will happen? Let's say z is such a bad literal. Now, we should ask, what is the probability that one example will not get rid of this z? Probability that z survives one example is 1 minus the probability that z is eliminated by it, right? But the probability that z is eliminated by it is the probability that it doesn't show up, which is p of z, by our learning algorithm. Our learning algorithm will eliminate all the features that are 0 in positive examples.
How you put epsilon by n, like, how do we assume that pz is upper bounded by?
We assume the whole thing is, if that happens, then if probability of z is upper bounded by epsilon over n, then what will happen? Then what can we say about the situation? Because then we'll turn it around the head and say, so first of all, if probability of z is upper bounded by epsilon over n, then the first point that we proved was this one. Then if there are no bad literals, the error is upper bounded. What if there are bad literals? Then we can start talking about each one of them. The probability that it will survive elimination is 1 minus epsilon over n. Probability that one literal will survive elimination is 1 minus epsilon over n. Okay? That's just total probability. We have m training examples. Probability that this x1 will survive elimination by m examples, because each example is independent, is just that is upper bounded by that quantity power m. Right? Now we are getting somewhere. There are this is for one bad literal. We know nothing about our functions. There are n variables. In the worst case, there can be n bad literals. The probability that some bad literal escapes elimination is simply n times that term. Right?
What is the intuition behind having P of z equal to epsilon over n?
It's mostly a trick to get the proof to work. It is the intuition is that any one literal will not cause too much damage. If that is the case, if the worst case, you're basically, remember that we're just calling it epsilon over n. We have no limits on what epsilon can be. It has to be upper bounded by something. Let's call it epsilon over n, and then see what happens. If it is upper bounded by epsilon over n, then the probability of a good hypothesis of having no bad literals, in other words, having a good hypothesis, is upper bounded. The error of a good hypothesis will be upper bounded by epsilon. And then now we can start talking about the bad hypotheses. Just call the P of z to be epsilon over n, and then see what happens.
Actually, it is, we are saying features are independent and identical.
Yes, that part shows up here.
And
The fact that the features are independent shows
even
up.
epsilon over n means like error is dissipated and all literals equally, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. Yes. And this style of proof is slightly more involved than the next proof that we'll see for Occam's razor, which is actually substantially less. It's basically the whole proof is one slide, like 4 lines of math. This one is more involved because we are making assumptions about the hypothesis class. it turns out making fewer assumptions about the hypothesis class simplifies proofs. So, yes.
Sorry.
Can go ahead.
Okay. I was just gonna ask, with a real example, is your data usually, are your features usually independent?
No. In fact, this doesn't, I actually take this back. This doesn't assume that the features have to be independent. This is the worst case. Because if the features were not independent, this probability will only be smaller. And to answer your question, it's very rare in real data to expect features to be independent. It's a fond hope of many theorems that happens, but in practice, there's no such guarantee. You had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to raise the same point and say that for the last inequality, we don't need the
Yes.
them to be independent.
Yes.
But for the second inequality, we need the training points to be independent.
For going from 1 to 2, you need the assumption that your training points are IID.
Yeah.
Going from 2 to 3 does not require any assumptions. It's simply union bound again. In fact, union bound is one of the most used inequalities in proving most of these learning theory results. There are a small number of probability inequalities that keep showing up again and again. Union bound is one of them. The law of large numbers. Tail inequalities like Chernoff bound and Hoeffding bound, which we'll see later on. In fact, we'll see Hoeffding in the next class, and your homework will make you work through an example that uses Chernoff. So anyway, that's jumping way too ahead. Right now what we have is the probability that one bad feature in this conjunction like x1 survives m examples is bounded by this term. Okay, but this is a convenient, the one on the right side is a rather convenient expression because we know how to handle those things. What do we want? We do not want any bad literals to survive. We want them all to be eliminated, which means we want this left hand side to be bounded on top. We have no control over the left hand side, but we know that it's bounded on top by the right hand side. So let's say that the right hand side is bounded on top by some small number. In other words, let's say that this probability, let's see what happens if we force this probability to be small, say less than delta. In other words, we want this n times 1 minus something power m to be less than some delta. So epsilon and delta are the parameters to this theorem. Okay? What will happen? Yes?
So delta is probability of wrong classification.
Delta is the probability that you will make a mistake. Exactly. So to simplify this, we can just use this simple trick that says 1 minus x is always less than e power minus x. Right? And just shove that into this, do some algebra, take log on both sides, and you get what we wanted to prove. If m is greater than a function that is linearly dependent on 1 over epsilon, logarithmically dependent on 1 over delta, and polynomially dependent on n, if the number of examples you have is more than that, then now you can work back every step. If the number of examples is more than that, then the probability that any bad literal will survive will be less than delta. Then the probability that your hypothesis function, I don't know what you pick, but whatever you pick will be bad, will be less than 1 minus delta, less than delta. In other words, the probability that your hypothesis is good is greater than 1 minus delta. So let's rewind this whole thing. And remember up front, when the hypothesis is good, the error will be less than epsilon. Right? Because of that union bound thing that we did in the front. So let's put that all together. If the probability that your classifier will make a mistake is less than delta, then we need these many examples. Or conversely, if we have these many examples, then with high probability, probability 1 minus delta, there will be no bad literals. In other words, with high probability, we'll have the error of the classifier less than epsilon.
Is that 1 base 10?
E, sorry.
E.
If I don't mention anything, it's usually E, unless it's 2. Typically, it doesn't matter because it's just a constant. So.
These are distinct examples. No repetition. Is there a condition on
There is no such condition. Every example is just drawn from the training set.
with it based on a distribution?
Based on the distribution,
There's a probability of the
there can always be probability. You can in fact compute that probability if you want, if you make some assumptions. So there is no assumption that you'll have distinct examples. Yes,
In this case, what's the natural log?
it is natural log. So I'll let you stare at this for a minute, and that's the reason I have the polynomial thing there, by the way. Again, just to point out, it's polynomial in n 1 over epsilon and 1 over delta. So I'll let you stare at this, but I'll also talk about what this means. Okay, this is a nice expression. Looks cute, but what does it mean? If the way to think about this is the following. If you want the error to be, say, 0.1, and you want the confidence of your learning algorithm to be 0.1, then for 100-dimensional examples, you can plug all those numbers into that. You will need 6,000 or about 7,000 examples. So this is a way of thinking about how many examples should I give, how big should my training size be if I want error less than something and I want a confidence more than, say in this case, 90%. Now, if for the same setting, for the same epsilon and delta, if your dimensionality is only 10, then you only need about 500 examples. But in the 10-dimensional case, if you demand that your confidence is 99%, then you'll need more examples, but notice that it's not a lot more. Increasing the confidence by 10 does not require so many more because there's a log term there. Questions about this? Questions about the proof, about more importantly, the statement of this thing and the style of the reasoning that we've employed. Yes.
So how do we come up with epsilon again?
In here or in general?
Just in general.
In general, you don't come up with epsilon. All you say is that my classifier will be epsilon right or epsilon wrong, basically, depending on. It will only have an error of less than epsilon if such and such property is true.
Okay.
So my classifier will have an error less than epsilon, and I can say that statement, or your learner can say that statement with confidence, with more than 1 minus delta, if you have these many examples. And here we've actually taken a constructive approach. I started off with a particular learning algorithm and proved some properties about it. Right? So, in general, we won't be doing that. In general, we'll not talk about a specific learning algorithm, but we'll talk about classes of functions. I don't know what the learning algorithm is, but there exists some learning algorithm that can have these properties. That's the style of proofs that we'll be looking at next. And these are not constructive proofs. They'll just say that I don't know what, and that's where we'll say that this concept is learnable or not. But just as a heads up, what we have here is a pack guarantee. This is called a pack style guarantee. Our algorithm is probably approximately correct. It may not be correct, It can only be approximately correct, and I'm not certain about it. It's probably right. So this is PAC learning, probably approximately correct learning. And in this case, we've analyzed a specific class of functions, namely monotone conjunctions. Other questions about it? Yeah.
In application, how do you decide how probable and how approximately you'd like to get?
These are mostly designed to understand. It's not so much for an application as it's to answer questions as, is this concept learnable at all? After I talk about defined PAC learning and Occam's razor, I'll go through a list of concept classes that you can't learn. I mean, I'm not going to prove any of those. I'll just say it has been proved that certain things are just not learnable. It doesn't matter what your epsilon and deltas are. It cannot be learned. And which means then you have to start thinking about other ways of what to do with it. So it's more of a reasoning tool about functions, a style of reasoning about functions.
So this isn't actually used to find how many examples you need in order to guarantee something?
In practice, there are so many other problems here because what happens is your learning algorithm may not. It's just these statements are an expectation, right? You have no guarantee. So you may see the same example multiple times. So
In practice, we don't have a example generator so that we can bound on it, right? We happen to have a certain set of examples.
yes, that's the other one.
And
No, in
and it's not in
well,
the
you
code.
could always ask the following thing. You have a training set. And you believe it comes from certain family of functions, you believe your hypothesis class is certain family of functions, and your training set has 1,000 examples. Is it worth even you inventing a learning algorithm for it? Because you only have 1,000 examples. Maybe for this concept to be learnable, you will need 1,000,000 examples, and 1,000 examples are not going to help.
Yeah, but we cannot make million examples because we need that.
We
Because
don't have it. We need the oracle.
Exactly.
So let me just summarize what I just said. We only looked at the class of conjunctions. Both the hypothesis and the concept class is a set of conjunctions. And what we have shown here is if you have n-dimensional inputs, namely n features, then, and if you have m examples where m is more than this quantity here, then with probability 1 minus delta, with high probability, the learning algorithm will produce a hypothesis whose error is less than epsilon. With high probability, the learning algorithm will produce a good hypothesis if you have enough examples. Once you remove all the math, the statement seems vacuous. If you have enough examples, the learning algorithm will produce a good hypothesis. But actually proving it is not trivial. So this was an instance of PAC learning, but let's define a general model for PAC learning. So let me quickly summarize all the notation that we have seen so far in one slide, just to remind you, because at this point we've collected quite a few symbols. X is an instance space consisting of n-dimensional inputs. Y is the output space, and Y is always Boolean, so true, false, -1, 1, 0, 1. There is a true function f, which is hidden from us, and it's a target function which is drawn from a class of functions called the concept class, C. Using the true function, we are given a training set, S, that's produced in the following way. There is a distribution over the inputs, over the instance space, D. According to the distribution, examples are sampled, the function f is applied to it, and now you get an x and a y, or x and f of x. This process is repeated m times independently, and these m examples constitute your training set. We'll use the letter h, small h, to define denote hypotheses. And just to remind you, hypotheses are the functions that your learning algorithm searches over, and the set of those functions, we'll call it h. And for the duration of at least all of today's lecture, in fact, we'll assume that c equals h. Even though we don't know the true function, we know that or c is either equal to or a subset of h, meaning the hypothesis, the true function f is also in h. We'll assume that. There are two errors that are interesting here. There is the training error, or it's also called the empirical error. This is the error on the training set of a hypothesis. What fraction of the training set is classified by the hypothesis h? We don't care about it. We can measure it, but we don't care about it because we don't care about doing well on the training set. What we care about is the true error, or the generalization error. The generalization error of a hypothesis is the probability that a new example x, which is drawn from the same distribution D, is assigned a different label by f and h. There's nothing new in this slide. This is just a summary of a lot of symbols that we had been throwing around. The kind of questions that we are interested in are, can we bound the true error, the generalization error, given the empirical error? If the empirical error is so much, can we make a statement that like the true error will not deviate too much from it? And we won't answer that question today. That's a question for next class. The question for today is a class of functions learnable? Are conjunctions learnable? Are Boolean functions learnable? Are not linear classifiers, but we are only talking about discrete functions for a finite set of functions. Is a certain class of functions learnable? What does learnable mean? Learnable means, I'll define it. I'll define what learnable is in this packed world. Is it learnable in the supervised setting? And that's actually what we are interested in for now. Remember that there are other protocols for learning. There's active learning, there's semi-supervised, unsupervised, and all those. Everything that we are looking at is the question of, is the class of function C learnable using a hypothesis H in the supervised setting? And if so, how many examples do you need to see so that you're guaranteed that you'll get a good hypothesis? And not guaranteed with 100% probability, guaranteed with high probability, just like we saw, that we'll get a good enough, and it's not a good, a perfect classifier, a good enough classifier. So, let's think about what this means. There is really no hope that your learner will exactly learn the concept, because you're only given a finite set of examples. Multiple functions, remember from the first lecture, there can be multiple functions that can be consistent with your training set. There's really no hope. It's possible that, the unseen examples, the future examples can have any label. And in fact, in an adversarial case, they will have any label. Moreover, the only thing that we add on this is we say that we agree in some sense, just between us, we decide that if uncommon examples that don't even show up in the training set are misclassified, it's okay. Because they are rare, they won't happen very often, so we'll survive. The other point that's important is that we really can't even hope for a close approximation. There's nothing a priori that guarantees that we will get a close approximation. Why? Because it's possible. There is a non-zero probability that your training set is not representative. It only consists of uncommon examples. Think of the case when, for example, suppose your training set is drawn from the Gaussian, and every example on your training set comes from the tail, and your test set is entirely drawn from the center, clearly not represented. So again, the only hope that we have is that the training set is actually representative and in fact drawn from the same distribution. These 2 points really, the reason I effectively have repeated these things is to point out that this kind of analysis about learning is inevitable. The only hope that we have is that it would be great if we can find with high probability a function that's a close approximation. Wouldn't it be great if we can do that? What are the regimes in which we can actually accomplish that? This is the idea of probably approximately correct learning. What does that mean? More formally, we are given two small numbers, epsilon and delta, both between 0 and 1. Epsilon typically always represents the error of a classifier. Delta represents 1 minus delta represents the confidence of your learner in the classifier. And pack learning requires that given these two numbers, with probability 1 minus delta, you find a classifier that has an error less than epsilon. And the only way we can actually get to that, or at least to our knowledge right now, is to make the assumption that the train and the test set come from the same distribution. This consistent hypothesis, consistent distribution assumption is what drives all the math forward. So let's define learnability in the pack setting. But before that, I want you to remind you of what it means to learn in the online setting. We defined mistake-bound learning to be loosely the following. If your learning algorithm makes a polynomial number of mistakes, then you call it mistake-bound learning. Right? A polynomial in the complexity parameters of the problem. We are going to make a similar kind of a statement for pack learning. And there's going to be a lot of symbols on this slide, so I'm going to slowly walk through that. Say you're given a concept class C, and the concept class consists of functions defined over instances from X, and each instance is an n-dimensional vector. Suppose you have a learning algorithm L. We will call C, will define that C is pack learnable. Remember, we're not talking about the learning algorithm being pack learnable. We're saying defining the concept class to be pack learnable. Using this algorithm, if for every function in C, it doesn't matter what the function is, even in the worst case, and for every distribution over the examples, again, the worst case, given two small numbers epsilon and delta, suppose you are given m examples sampled independently from this D, then your learning algorithm will somehow figure out a function h which has error less than epsilon, and the probability that your learning algorithm actually gets that h is high. It's more than 1 minus delta. If this condition is true, then we will say that concept C is pack learnable in with L, with the learning algorithm L. Oh, in fact, there's one more condition. The number of training examples has to be polynomial in all these parameters. In 1 over epsilon, 1 over delta, the dimensionality, and the number of functions in the hypothesis class. So this is a mouthful. This is a long, long, long sentence. So I'm going to let you read it by yourself and ask me questions.
You said that finding a hypothesis H with error less than epsilon is greater than 1 minus delta.
The probability that you will find that hypothesis
H is greater than 1 minus delta.
yes.
But we say that H makes an H does not make an error is greater than 1 minus delta. That's what we said. Are these two statements similar?
Can you repeat that?
So the probability of error, making error for H is
Less than the probability that H will make an error is less than epsilon. And the probability that your algorithm will find one such function that makes an error less than epsilon is high.
is dependent on data.
Is greater than 1 minus delta. I would suggest read it from end to end once, stare at it, and then bother me with questions because it's a lot of. Yes.
Yeah, actually, could you go over just one more time to say?
So let's clear out all the the symbols that we've already seen before. The primary bit here is these two lines, the last two. If your learning algorithm finds a hypothesis which is good, and by good I mean it makes a small number of errors, the error of that hypothesis, the generalization error of that hypothesis is less than epsilon. That's what I call a good hypothesis. If your learning algorithm uses these M examples to find a hypothesis, and every time, and let's say you do this infinite number of times, the fraction of hypotheses that your learning algorithm produces which are good will be more than 1 minus delta. And your learning algorithm knows how to do this using only a polynomial number of examples. Does that help?
Oh, a question. Sure. So the size of H in the last was actually a function of n. And with
it could be a function of n.
No, I mean in the last proof we did for the
basically, basically.
That's
yes,
why it wasn't there.
Yes.
It's effectively blended in.
Yes, it's blended in. And in fact, you've already seen in your homework too this case of you calculated the size of H for a hypothesis class, the number of functions. Size of H is simply the number of functions, right? This is just a generalization of the previous statement that we saw. You have a learning algorithm that using only a polynomial number of examples is able to find a classifier that's good, and it does so with 1 minus delta times. Yes.
Could you define a polynomial number of examples? What do you mean by polynomial?
It's if I write down m as a function of these four things, it's O of in big O notation, it's polynomial.
But so in the previous example, don't we have a log term like
Yeah, sure, that's polynomial as well. Log n log, it's an n log n.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there any more specific definition? Not definition. As in that we say that this concept class is highly learnable only with respect to this distribution over there.
No. The general definition of path learnability
is for all.
Is for
But I'm asking that is there any weaker definition that we say that okay, so this concept class is not path learnable, but it is path learnable with this value?
I'm not aware of that actually. I don't think so. I've not seen it. Because typically you don't know the distribution, so in true theory style, you make the worst case assumption. By the way, this definition is not yet done. There's still a little bit more. This only says that a concept is path learnable. And just to remind you, when I say error, I mean the true error, the error according to the generalization error, not the training error. A concept class C is remember, here in the first bit, we never spoke about how long the learning algorithm runs for. We never spoke about computational complexity. We only talked about what is called sample complexity. This is an information theoretical statement. There is enough information to learn. We never said that this algorithm will actually learn it in a reasonable amount of time. So, a concept is efficiently pack learnable if the learning algorithm can produce a hypothesis which satisfies all these properties in a polynomial time. And polynomial in what? In the same complexity parameters. Questions? The way you use this kind of a statement, this is just a definition. We are defining certain classes of functions to be pack learnable. And sometimes we'll even say things like, this class of functions is pack learnable. There exists an algorithm L which satisfies this property, and the concept class is pack learnable. I just don't know what the algorithm is. And then you can say, go find it.
Isn't n the size of the whole data set and n the size of the training set only?
N is the dimensionality of the input space. Number of features. So let's kind of savor this definition and interpret it so that we get a better feel for it. These two definitions impose two kinds of limitations. The first one is a question of sample complexity. I've never used this term before, and this is an important phrase that shows up a lot. Sample complexity simply says, sample complexity is the number of examples you need to learn a function. And pack learnability demands polynomial sample complexity. There should be enough information in only a polynomial number of examples such that I can recover a good approximation for the true function. So pack learning demands polynomial sample complexity. And this is an information theoretic idea. Is there enough information in this data set for me to learn? Okay? There's also a computational complexity bit, which is the efficiency. Sometimes, in fact, we will see one example where the sample complexity is good, but the computational complexity kills us. So, the pack learning also demands, or efficient pack learning also demands polynomial computational complexity. There may be enough information in the training data set, but can an algorithm efficiently recover it to produce a hypothesis in polynomial time? There are two aspects to pack learning here. So, what this means is that, there's also another aspect here. First of all, the hypothesis should contain a function which can produce close approximation. Otherwise, you're never going to find it. If it does not even show up, if there is no function in your hypothesis class that is a good approximation for your true function, good luck finding it if it doesn't exist. So that's why we made this assumption that that H is equal to C or a subset of C. Some people call the setting where H equal to C to be properly pack learnable. It's just a name that probably will not show up anywhere after this slide. And notice that what we have here is a worst case definition. We are looking at, effectively they are saying that let an adversary pick the distribution over the instances, and let an adversary pick the target function. And even in these cases, my learning algorithm will find the true one. And only those concept classes are pack learnable. Which, if you think about it, is a rather strict definition. Any thoughts about this? By the way, historical note, this idea of pack learning showed up in a paper, it's about some 30, it showed up in a paper in 1984 called The Theory of the Learnable, or Theory of the Learnable. A very cool paper. If you have the time, I would suggest you read it. It's by Leslie Valiant, and it's one of the, 3 things that he did that was cited for his Turing Award. And this is like the pretty neat characterization of what it means for something to be learnable. This is the first time we are seeing in this kind of an adversarial setting, what learnability is. We are talking about classes of functions being learnable or not. And I don't expect you to savor it and understand it just by sitting in this class. So go home and take a look at these slides and work through them. I mean, I think the best way to actually figure out math is to work it out, rather than, I don't think it's possible to learn math by seeing. So ideally, I would have liked to work through the steps on this board, but then this whiteboard is not enough, then I have to deal with chalk dust. So assuming that you know you remember exactly what pack learning means, or at least you have a feel for it. If there are enough examples for an algorithm is a concept class is pack learnable, if given a set of examples that is polynomial, with high confidence, with high probability, your learning algorithm will produce a good classifier. The formal version of that is pack learnability. Efficient pack learnability says that your learning algorithm will run only for a reasonable amount of time. That's the intuitive version of the story. So let's try to look at connections between this and an age-old idea called Occam's razor. Occam's razor comes from, I think, William of Occam. And that's, according to Wikipedia, his photograph. And it's simply this idea that prefer simpler explanations. There's a Latin version of that statement that obviously those of you who know Latin can understand. But if you don't trust me, it means do not posit more plurality than necessary. That's the translation of that statement. Do not make it more complicated than needed, which is exactly the opposite of what I just did. And this is a very old idea. It shows up in different schools of philosophy, and it's a very vague idea that without math is meaningless. So let's try to make it more formal. Yes.
Are these posted online?
Yes.
I just checked.
It is online.
My refresh.
Oh no,
it goes all the way to page 40.
Oh really? Okay, so it's possible that the script died and I have to restart it. Okay, I'll figure it out. It will be on. In general, slides will be online at least after the lecture, because I tend to make corrections right after the lecture. In the 10 minutes that are left, I'm going to prove this statement and point out that it's actually roughly equivalent to pack learning. To do that, I'm going to make a claim. Given your usual definition of epsilon, h, m and all that, the probability that there is a hypothesis h that is both consistent with m examples and makes a bad error, makes an error more than epsilon, has to be less than this quantity. The probability that notice that this claim has nothing to do with learning algorithms. It's just a statement. Probability that there exists a hypothesis that is both consistent with many examples and yet is bad is upper bounded by this quantity. To prove that, let's say H is one such hypothesis, a bad hypothesis. It has a generalization error more than epsilon. The probability that it's consistent with one example from the training set is 1 minus epsilon. Why? Probability that it will make a mistake on an example is more than epsilon. So the probability that it will not make a mistake on a training set, on a training example, is less than 1 minus epsilon. So probability it will make a mistake on one example is less than 1 minus epsilon. But we know that this hypothesis has survived not one but m examples, all of which are independent. So we pull the same trick again. The probability that this hypothesis survives m examples is upper bounded by 1 minus epsilon power m. Same thing that we've done before. It's just a union bound again. Or actually no, this is not, this is the fact that these examples are independent. This is the probability that one example satisfies this problem, is consistent. Our hypothesis H comes from a class of functions, capital H. Probability that there is some function that has this property is bounded by the size of the number of such functions times the probability that that function is bad. That gives us the claim. Notice that I have not spoken about any algorithm. This is just properties of hypothesis spaces, and simply the fact that if your function is consistent with many examples, most likely it's not a bad function. That's the intuitive version of the statement. And this statement, just reconfiguring the statement and simplifying it, gives us something that is called the Occam's razor. So I've just moved that statement back, and just like before, we want this probability to be less than delta. We want the probability that we will end up with a bad hypothesis to be less than some delta. I don't know what learning algorithm we're using, but irrespective of what it is, we want this quantity to be less than delta. So let's just enforce it and take the log, because we like adding things up, and also we know how to talk about log of 1 minus x. When x is small, we know that e power x is greater than 1 minus x, or equivalently log of 1 minus x is less than minus x. Right? Or did I say greater? Less than. Log of 1 minus x is less than x, 1 minus x, or for small epsilon. So let's just put a bound on, let's just replace that in our statement above. Okay? And then apply some algebra, get m on one side, get everything else on the other side, and you get a statement that looks like this. If m is greater than a function that is linear in 1 over epsilon and has a log dependency on the size of the hypothesis and a log dependency on 1 over delta, then the probability of getting this bad hypothesis is small. From here to here is just algebra, except for this one trick that I've used, and I'm not going to mention it. I hope someone catches it later on. The jump from here to here involves the inequalities don't quite work out, and you have to stare at it hard. Let me tell you what is wrong. Log of 1 minus epsilon is less than epsilon. And here also there's a less than. I can't just plug this in and hope for things to be true. But what I've done here is a more insidious thing. What I've done is, if this is true, then this is also true. And that's how you get the statement. If this is true, then the thing on top becomes true. And you see this very often in the learning theory proofs. You get an upper bound and then you say that if the upper bound is true, then the thing below it is also true, and then you continue. If you didn't quite catch that, try to work out this series of arguments, and then you will find yourself stuck.
It is log of 1 minus epsilon less than epsilon or less than minus epsilon?
Minus. It should be, oh, there's a mistake. This should have been e power minus x. This is the kind of fix that I'll put in the slide after the class. Okay, so since there are only 2 minutes left, I'm going to just continue with pointing out why this is Occam's razor, and then we'll continue again in the next class. So what we have is the following. For any hypothesis space, finite hypothesis space, because we're talking about the size of this class, for any finite hypothesis space with probability 1 minus delta, a hypothesis of a function h inside this hypothesis space will be consistent. That is a function that is consistent with m training examples will have an error less than epsilon if m is greater than this quantity. That's basically the statement we have here. Why is this Occam's razor? Notice that there's a dependence on the size of the hypothesis space. Smaller hypothesis spaces require fewer examples. If size of h is small, then you need much fewer examples to learn. If size of h is large, then the number of examples you need to make this kind of a guarantee is large. In other words, prefer simpler hypothesis spaces. And this really gives a condition for when a consistent hypothesis that's consistent with m examples will generalize well. Let me leave you with this final thought, which is, notice that nothing here says that more complicated or more convoluted hypothesis spaces are bad. It's just that a function from it's highly unlikely that a simpler function will fool us by being consistent with many examples. That's all the statement says, which is why you prefer simple examples. If you find something that's simpler, that's consistent, very likely that it will be consistent in the future. We'll continue with, I'll repeat this proof in the next class, and we'll continue from here. And I'll be around if there are any questions, and I encourage you to go through this again so that it does not seem too alien.